Uh, Latency is actually a perfectly good way for me to start the presentation. For all of you that evaluate government data, as we all know, government makes predictions and or makes statements about what happened in unemployment or in any other part of their roll-up of data, and then they revise it 30, 60 days later. And in the meantime, outsiders with access to data that is at least as inaccurate and sometimes less complete make other guesses. The stock market goes up, the stock market goes down. There's absolutely no reason to have hedge fund managers making a living off of outguessing two different groups of disparate data, which is not only not real time, but it's not accurate. So what the Data Act attempts to do is to take what began as USA spending, what began as the recovery boards accounting for stimulus funds, and say, well, wait a second here. We can, by standardizing the input data both from the contributor, being the government, and the recipient, we can standardize this data and then roll up additional data under the same financial model. If we do that, all of you, given the same information or access to substantially the same information, can in real time predict and report with the government. And we believe that eliminates a great deal of what is in fact hedging that goes on and uncertainty. But it's more important than that. Our goal on the Oversight Committee is to create transparency. Transparency of the data we give you is not transparency. Transparency of data that can be meaningfully changed with compiled with innovative minds looking at disparate data throughout government allows for a type of research, reporting, compiling that has never been seen before. And from my standpoint, I know one thing, that accuracy creates greater interest. If I'm going to hear on CNBC a figure and then sort of as an anecdotal after fact, 3 weeks, 4 weeks later, I get a number that is substantially different, the next time I hear the data, it's not as meaningful. But if I see and can see multiple opinions in real time on data, and they are either close together or they're having a real argument about what common data means when evaluated, we can now have interest in real time. Last week I spoke to groups that were involved in both predictive and forensic research. Predictive is what you're dealing with, but when I work with IGs, they would love to have access to predictive. Today, they only have forensic, and in many cases, they have stovepiped forensic. They only know, after the fact, a portion of the data, and it frustrates them. We're going to change that. The Data Act is bipartisan, which in here in Washington is very unusual, but one of the reasons is that people who want to know from the left and the right want to be in the know. We believe that by mandating standard reporting and a process of greater transparency, and of course the tools created to make this easy and inexpensive for the private sector to participate in, will give us an opportunity which will sometimes be used by the left or the right, or often used by simply people who have a vested interest in advising the private sector accurately on what is, has, and will become events in government, or for that matter, events in the private sector that are being aggregated through the government. Your industry is going to be essential because if we give you more accurate, more easily compiled data, unless you turn it into information that's valuable, we haven't really accomplished what we want to. The same is true, though, unless you do it, my IGs won't have private sector solutions that allow them to pick up COTS or near COTS solutions that are affordable and valuable and use them in evaluating government to drive out waste and fraud in government. There are some problems. I've got to tell you, and I'll tell you one of them that's most notable. Universities don't want to report the kind of data that the Data Act envisions. And it took me a long time to realize that one of the reasons is they say it's burdensome, but in fact they're fairly large recipients of dollars. But they do have a situation in which they receive dollars for one thing, and they're very concerned that as they distribute it and use it, people may criticize how they use it. My view is we can either change the grants to allow the uses they're actually doing, or we can tell them that, quite frankly, they're going to have to use it in the way in which they bid it. That causes me to know that I'm not going to have currently major universities supporting this because they seem to have a vested interest in less exact reporting. That's where I need your help. I need you to recognize, and hopefully in your Q&A we'll go further, that it is very obvious that more data and more accuracy is in everyone's best interest, but only the people who will create the tools and use the tools and create new products and actually grow an industry with this information can make the case for why this is good for America at all levels, and certainly a model for the rest of the world in which we're behind, not in front. It's a lonely place unless you have the private sector on board here in government today, because ultimately everybody from the president on down is talking about the private sector being so important. This is your chance. Ask me questions. Make this bill better before it becomes law, and then we'll have something that quite frankly, you've been part of shaping. And with that, Alex, I understand you're going to open this for Q&A.
Yes, sir. Thank you very much for joining us over the magic of the internet here, again, appropriately. One of the areas that talked about is standards, and that's not a small issue. One of the specific standards is XBRL, Extensible Business Resource Language. And as people who are following the space know, the public companies now have to report their earnings to the SEC. And if you go online, you can see xbrl.sec.gov. Would you be recommending XBRL in this context, and why?
Well, first of all, we will be recommending it because it's widely accepted more and more within government, because it's being more widely accepted worldwide, and because, quite candidly, it's an open format run by nonprofits who you can get a seat at the table, if you want to get a seat at the table, to making sure that the standards continue to evolve in a way in which this rich metadata is easily used. But as I look at it, we stop having cells in the way that our old DB2 and DB3 guys look at it, cells that don't line up, that take a lot of manipulation. And I'll just give you a simple example. If you create a report in which all of your source information is XBRL, and you want to run that report weeks or months or years later, you simply go to the source data, run it, you create your report. Today, more than 2/3 of all expenses related to reporting is in fact compiling and manipulating the data before they begin the process of actually reporting it out. That means we can get 3 reports in XBRL for the cost of 1 with current databases.
Thank you, Chairman. One of the key words you use there is cost. As you're well aware, the e-government fund has been under some scrutiny and has seen some cuts. First, the House cut, and then last week we learned that the Senate cut as well. And that actually goes to a number of the different open government data platforms that people think about in this context. Certainly things like data.gov, or the recently launched performance.gov, or usaspending.gov. Now, the Data Act would propose replacing usaspending.gov, which is, again, has had a number of data accuracy and reporting issues, some of which the Sunlight Foundation talked about over the last week or so. But this general issue of saving money through spending some money on these open government data platforms is a pretty hot one in Washington. What do you think about these cuts that we've seen in Congress in both houses now? Do you think there's bipartisan support for restoring some of those funds once they actually now have left the appropriations committees and enter the full chambers? And in that context, will there be support for the Data Act and obviously some amount of spending that it would take to create what you've envisioned? And I should say that the White House has also, through an executive order, proposed something similar, so there is support from the executive branch in moving forward in some way.
Well, and I'll start in reverse order. There's tremendous support from the executive branch. This is a place in which Vice President Biden has engaged. He's worked with both the Recovery Board's chairman, Earl Devaney, and with our committee. And he gets it, I think, in a way that, Joe Biden's not known as Mr. Digital, but he very much gets it that this is a different way of looking at how we do this, that the consolidation has value beyond just cost savings, and he's been a big proponent. Quite frankly, he's been part of the reason that we're getting the administration more broadly, including OMB, realizing that a single solution is critical, and that data standards are critical in order to have a single solution that's going to work. Is there a pressure in government to make cuts? Yes. Are those cuts sometimes wrong-minded? Absolutely. You know, I'm having a 6.5% cut on oversight of government. So, you know, you always look and say, so I've got to work with 6.5% less to find waste and fraud in government estimated to be over $200 billion. You know, cutting a $6 million budget that looks at $200 billion just in fraud is amazing. So we're looking at and saying, we've got to act quickly. We've got to act when there's still both consolidation savings and transitional funds. And I have an assurance by appropriators that if we make the case for the transitional money within a 10-year window, meaning you spend more now, you save more later, that we'll have the funds we need. And that's part of the strategy, is we've got to look at 10 years because, as you say, it costs money to make this transition.
The Data Act itself proposes consolidating a number of different sites that may be familiar to some Americans, but not all of them. The flagship is, of course, recovery.gov, where we try to do tracking of spending from the stimulus that went in a couple of years ago. USAspending.gov, which then Senator Obama actually was supported, and then the CFFR. What would be some of the potential savings from consolidating those platforms, and how do you look at the numbers behind them?
Well, the tremendous savings starts off with a single point of contact. When people go and they know that they can get rich data and they don't have to go to multiple places and try to compile it, they get an advantage. Additionally, if there's a problem in accuracy or reporting, it gets reported to a single point of interest. Obviously, a lot of savings there. But where we want to assure people is the idea of data standards in a cloud world does not mean that all the data will reside in one place. Just the opposite. It'll reside wherever it's most cost effective, whether it's in a very few large data centers or it's spread throughout both government and the cloud. And that's part of what's going to be important, is we're not going to spend money arbitrarily consolidating data. We're trying to create a situation in which one point allows you to go to multiple locations behind the scenes, if you will, to extract the data, but extract it with predictability. Our real view, though, is that it costs a lot of money to be criticized in government. We're creating a site that is intended to be exactly like Earl Devaney's site was in recovery, which was, look, it was so easy to search that very quickly people figured out that it had flaws in reporting, like congressional districts that didn't exist, and so on. But it was good because the maximum number of people were going there. You mentioned the Sunlight Foundation, but they and plenty of others, and scrutinizing a site. We want to have that single point so we can make it better, and we can make it better with one program change, not 25 or 30 little kingdoms and fiefdoms making those changes. So that's part of it. Understand, though, we view that the greatest savings from our conversion is not how much it costs to run websites. It's, in fact, the waste in government, the inefficiencies of government that will be driven down by accurate data.
One of the pieces of news we see in this particular space is this launch of the Open Government Partnership around the globe yesterday. I think 44 different countries are now becoming involved in this. And there's a great deal of interest in what open government data can do around the globe, right? And the launching of different data platforms. As you look at the different initiatives that other countries are taking, what are some of the lessons learned that you would share from our own country's experience, and some of the specific takeaways that is we look at the U.S. national plan for the next step of open government and open data in that context, specifically around regulatory data, that you would recommend looking at and that you will be overseeing?
Well, first of all, in reverse order again, regulatory data is one in which our committee is constantly trying to find out on a proposed regulation. Over 4,000 of them in the pipeline right now. The regulatory requirements, are they being met? And this is one of those areas in which how they're reported, what the progress is, there's no uniformity. So it's very hard to go to one place and say, for example, I'm in the chemical industry, or I'm, as I was in the electronics industry, what regulations are coming that affect me? There's no single point to say, based on a few keywords in a Google 2 in your case, type search, am I going to get meaningful data? The answer is today you won't. I was recently meeting with one of the senators from Argentina, and I've got to tell you, in South America, they're very interested in getting to where we are in transparency. And I agreed to go to a conference in South America, but I explained to him that I was going to be there talking about how America had to get to a much higher level of transparency than we were, because today what is transparent is what we report, rather than, and this is where the game has to change, we report everything, you decide, not to take anything from Fox, but we today are very selective in what we put out, and we organize it in a way that we want to present it. It's good government, but it's not real transparency. The next level is real transparency, where if you have a right to know, we're willing to take the chance that you're going to compile data and know more than we intended you to know. But that's to be dealt with after we give you all the information, not give you limited information spoon-fed to meet some political agenda of the left or the right.
One of the proposed parts of the U.S. National Plan for Open Government is some reform of regulations.gov. What are some of the issues that you look at as you oversee that particular part of government, and the ways that data standards can play a role in terms of some sort of algorithmic regulation? We understand that in many cases industries, including the data science world, are rushing ahead of where government itself is, and yet there needs to be some kind of context for the American people to understand what's being done on their behalf or done with their data. Where do you see regulations.gov evolving towards, and in the larger context, how do you think about personal data ownership?
Well, that last one is extremely important, and you've managed to get enough questions in that the last answer is always the most important. Our view is that personal ownership, if you will, ownership of what we've given as you've compiled, today we have to maintain that. We have to recognize that the ability to sift through this convoluted source data, we have to give you the ability to retain it because the cost is so high. In the future, our view is we're going to drive down the cost of the individual compiling dramatically. And what that means to us, the tools for doing compiling to get the data in a usable format should become de minimis, which they're not today. The analysis of what it really means will always be of great value. And one might say that if you look at something that we all get to see once in a while, and you'll see more of it, the polls, how is so-and-so doing in the polls? Well, you can give 10 people the same source data from a poll, and you can get very different predictions as to what's going to happen. That's where we hope to be, is that we're all looking at the same core information, including regulatory proposals and underlying science, and then let there be a healthy debate, particularly during the public comment that often is part of proposed regulations, as to what they see. But what I want to get away from in financial data and in regulatory data is people arguing two sets of facts. We should be arguing two sets of opinions on one set of common data that can be analyzed and agreed to, so that ultimately the decision is more linear rather than, if you will, a vast group of people who look at different facts, reach different conclusions, then you and I have to deal with whether or not their conclusion was wrong because of the wrong data. I don't want that anymore. If the conclusion's wrong, at least it should have been on the same data. And I want to thank you for giving us this opportunity. Our committee wants to work individually with many of the people in your audience who will choose to contact us, because we want to get it right. If the bill is not sufficient and broad enough to do what needs to happen post-passage, we need to work with you. We don't want to clean it up afterwards.